Good afternoon, councillors, and welcome to the special meeting for the August 2023. The meeting is open to the public and will also be live streamed. And I'd like to thank all of you in the room today and acknowledge everyone watching via council social media channels. And I'm just going to say go the Matildas right now because I'll probably forget later on after all the excitement of the meeting. So we will open the meeting by acknowledging the Mayor, Portfolio Leader Councillor Carl, Councillors, CEO and General Manager of Planning and Development Group. I acknowledge the Aboriginal parties whose songlines traverse these lands we meet on today, the Western Waka, Waka, Guybil and Jarawar peoples, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the knowledge, the rich traditions and bold ambitions of Australia's First Peoples. Item number 2 is attendance, including apologies, leave of absence, granting leaves of absence and declarations of conflict of interest. So we have an apology from Councillor Melissa Taylor. I need a resolution to accept that apology. Councillor the Mayor. And seconded by Councillor Shine. All those in favour? There are no leave of absences and there is no granting of leave of absences, but we do have one declaration of a prescribed conflict of interest. Councillor Von Hoff.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I would like to inform the meeting that I have a declarable conflict of interest because a person who teaches one of my children has made a submission in relation to this application. The name of the person is Ms. Reid. The nature of my relationship with Ms. Reid is that she teaches one of my children. This application is number MCU 2/2022/3617, development application for a development permit for material change of use impact, place of worship located at 3 Schmidt Court, Top Camp, Queensland 43550. Ms. Reid, by petition, is opposing the development. I wish to participate in the decision in relation to this matter. I acknowledge that eligible councillors must now determine, pursuant to section 150 ES of the Local Government Act 2009, whether I, 1, may participate in the decision about the matter, including by voting on the matter, 2, must leave the meeting, including any area set aside for the public, and stay away from the meeting while the eligible councillors discuss and vote on the matter, or 3, may participate in the decision about the matter subject to conditions.
Thanks, Councillor Von Hoff. Questions for the Deputy Mayor? Mayor?
Thanks, Madam Chair. No, I actually don't have any questions because I think the councillor, by way of mentioning that her desire is to stay in the room, clearly has measured in her own mind that she has the capacity to make a decision based on the information that we have and not any other prior knowledge. And therefore, I believe that there is no reason why the councillor can't stay in the room, participate and vote on the matter, for the reasons being that the association is removed by way of a child being taught by one of the submitters, and that there is no greater or lesser advantage to the councillor in the assessment of this application.
Thank you. So you're moving that. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Carol Taylor. All those in favour? Very good. There was nobody voted against, was there? No. Okay, so now item number 3. Can I have someone move the suspension of standing orders for item number 4, please? Councillor McMahon and Councillor Von Hoff. All those in favour? Thank you. Item number 4 is the development application for a development permit for a material change of use impact place of worship located at 3 Schmidt Court, Top Camp. Our Emily Hinchcliffe, our planner, is going to take us through it. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. Good afternoon, councillors. The report in front of you today presents the assessment of a development application for material change of use for a place of worship at 3 Schmidt Court, Top Camp. The subject site is located within the rural residential zone within the 4,000 metre squared minimum precinct of the Toowoomba Regional Planning Scheme 2012. Could we just bring up attachment 4, figure 3, please? Attachment 4, figure 3, yeah. That's the one. So the subject site is also located within the Airport Environs Overlay, the Regional Infrastructure Corridors and Substations Overlay, and the Flood Hazard Overlay, which is indicated on that figure there. The place of worship, however, is located entirely outside of the extent of that mapped flood hazard overlay, so it's essentially in the eastern portion of the site. Further, the site does not contain any easements for gas pipelines. You can see that there's an easement which is located in that yellow section above the site that adjoins the northwestern boundary. This is where the gas pipeline ultimately lies, and given that the gas pipeline isn't on the site, it is considered that the proposed development will not cause any impact upon the safe operation and maintenance of that pipeline. It is also noted that if the place of worship were located on the New England Highway, then the development would have been code accessible. However, the subject site does not actually have any frontage to the New England Highway, as there is a small access strip with a width of 10 centimetres wide in favour of Toowoomba Regional Council located between the site and the highway. Given it does not have the frontage to that highway, it has become an impact accessible application. So during the assessment of the proposed development, consideration has been given to the purpose of the Rural Residential Zone Code, which does allow for non-residential uses to be established within the zone, provided that they meet the day-to-day convenience needs of the residential catchment, are compatible with the semi-rural and low-intensity residential character of the zone, and do not impact the amenity of surrounding land uses. So if we move to figure 4, so just below this one. So the proposed place of worship seeks to establish a small single-storey building with a total gross floor area of 148 metres squared. The building will comprise a lobby, meeting room, and associated amenities. It is proposed to be used by a maximum of 50 people for twice weekly congregations at 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. on Sundays and 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. on Mondays. A total of 21 formal car parking spaces are provided to the south of the building, including one person with disability space. A further grassed area further to the south of the formal car parking area also provides for a total of 28 informal car parking spaces for any overflow. A 2-metre wide landscaping strip is also provided along the full Schmidt Court frontage to screen the site and the proposed buildings and associated car parking from the streetscape. It is considered that the built form of the place of worship is consistent with the low density form of housing in the area, particularly noting that the building proposed is smaller than other existing dwellings located within the street. Further, the scale and intensity of the congregations of the proposed place of worship is consistent with other existing non-residential uses within the area, particularly with regard to an existing place of worship to the north, located at the corner of Top Camp Court and New England Highway. It is further considered that the proposed church will meet the day-to-day needs of the community, particularly given that the proposal will essentially work to accommodate an increase in churchgoers to the existing church to the north, while seeking to maintain the residential amenity by ensuring both places of worship remain small in scale. Conditions of approval are to be imposed on the place of worship to limit the number of people on site at any one time to 50 people. A noise impact assessment was also submitted to council to demonstrate that the place of worship will not result in any noise impacts that may affect the amenity of surrounding residential premises. The noise impact assessment provided recommendations for noise management measures, including managing the use of amplified music and speech inside the place of worship and ensuring that all doors and windows of the building remain closed during these times. Council's environmental officers have reviewed the noise impact assessment and advised that this report is suitable for endorsement and that the recommendations are acceptable for ensuring that the place of worship does not cause noise nuisance to surrounding sensitive receptors at the hours of operation. Conditions of approval which set compliant noise level limits are to be imposed, as well as conditions relating to the proposed acoustic mitigation treatments to ensure noise is appropriately mitigated and managed. Conditions have also been imposed to limit the hours of operation to 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. on Sundays and 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. on Mondays. A traffic impact assessment was also submitted, which, as advised by Council's engineer, demonstrated that traffic volumes generated by the development along Schmidt Court and Bewley Drive are significantly under the expected traffic volumes for local roads. It is noted that the provision of the 21 formal on-site car parking spaces is consistent with the car parking rates identified under the Toowoomba Regional Planning Scheme for a place of worship with a gross floor area of 148 metres squared and a maximum capacity of 50 people. As such, it is considered that all car parking provision can be met on site without the need for any on-street car parking. So conditions will be imposed on the place of worship to ensure these car parking spaces are provided. However, conditions are also to be imposed requiring that the development provide no parking signs along its Schmidt Court frontage to further ensure no on-street parking occurs. The application being impact accessible was publicly notified. Accounting for duplicates and resubmissions, a total of 39 properly made submissions were received, including 2 petitions. Of these submissions, 9 were made in support of the application and 30, including the 2 petitions, objected to the proposed development. Broadly, the matters raised in submissions included concerns relating to land use, community need, scale and hours of operation, traffic and road safety impacts, pedestrian safety, lack of car parking, amenity impacts, impacts of flooding, and impacts on surrounding development from the on-site sewerage system. The matters raised in submissions were considered in the assessment of the development application, and responses to these matters were detailed within the report. The proposed development has been assessed against all relevant matters, including the entire planning scheme to the extent relevant, and the state planning policy, as outlined in the report. It has been concluded that the proposed place of worship is of a scale and intensity consistent with the semi-rural and low-intensity residential character of the zone, will provide for the day-to-day needs of the surrounding community, and will maintain the residential amenity of surrounding residential premises. Accordingly, the proposed development generally complies or can be conditioned to comply with the planning scheme and is considered acceptable having regard to matters raised in submissions and the site context. As such, the proposed development is recommended to be approved subject to reasonable and relevant conditions.
Thank you, Emily. Councillors, questions for the officer? Councillor O'Shea?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you. I just want to ask around the limitation of those on site at 50. Is that has that a number that has been indicated by the applicant, or is that a number that we have imposed, or both?
Councillor, through the chair, it is a number that was indicated by the applicant, but has also been imposed as it is consistent with the conditions for the place of worship to the north. So it's consistent with the limits that other churches in the area have been conditioned to comply with.
Okay. Follow up if I can. Thank you. And I guess so in terms of the how that is applied. So if I'm a neighbour, what do I say? I think I saw 72 people in there, or like, I mean, how, do you know what I mean? Like, I understand what's been put in place, but I'm also questioning or wanting to understand the practicality of limiting that number to a site and how that is actually, you know, how that's followed through, how that's adhered to, how that's monitored, how that's useful.
Sure. So the applicant, it is up to them to comply with their conditions of approval. However, if it appears as though they aren't, neighbours can contact council, and we do have a section of council that does investigate those matters to see if they are being upheld, those conditions are being upheld.
Thank you. Sorry, and just one more. So if the intensity of this was greater than 50, it wouldn't fit the code. Is that right?
Councillor, through the chair, it could potentially fit the intent of the code. It would depend on what the amenity impacts would come back as, and would be up for further assessment. But all assessing reports that we have had received and reviewed are based on the 50.
You done, councillor Carl?
Yeah, just a question along the same lines as Councillor James. Without going there is my favourite chestnut about how you regulate this, and an ongoing cost to ratepayers to regulate in the event you get a complaint. However, in the site layout, there is a number of discretional informal car parks, and on an average of 2 people per car would take the amount of people on site if those car parks were full way above 50 on my count, if that's an accurate plan. So why are we allowing an informal car park to, in my humble opinion, allow potentially way more than 50 people to be on site?
Councillor, through the chair, I should mention that at the beginning of the application, it was proposed for 110 persons on site. In response to submissions, the applicant did reduce back down to 50 spaces for the site, and the car parking has been left over from the original design while still allowing for additional car parking in the event that there are more than 21 cars that do attend. The condition for the 50 people should limit that down.
So 21 cars would easily accommodate 50 people in the church. So are you saying the informal car park is gone now on the plans, or it still exists?
It's still on the plans, but we have not conditioned them to provide that full amount. We've only conditioned the 21.
Yeah, it's not that what we've conditioned them to provide, and so much it's the capacity that they could have more than 21 cars, because, you know, an average of 2, most likely more than 2 in some cars, will take a limit of the people in the complex to 50, with the hard stand car park there as it is. So my question is, you know, as part of the conditions, to ensure that it's adhered to, we're sort of saying, yeah, well, you know, adhere to 50, but if you work an average of 2 people per car, the capacity for that site for people to park has way more than 50 people capacity to actually be on that site at one time.
Thank you, councillor. So as Emily has indicated, the original proposal had a substantially greater number of persons proposed, and the applicant responded through the assessment process, in particular to submissions, by reducing the total capacity. The conditions that are recommended in the report don't require more than 21 car parking spaces as proposed. We have no requirement in the report as it's currently drafted, or in the conditions as they're currently drafted, to remove those overflow spaces. It is entirely conceivable that with a number of single person households, they may, to reach their capacity of 50, require more than 21 cars on site. So council officers tend to take a proponent's proposal very seriously when they indicate a limitation that they are comfortable working with. In this case, the proponents have indicated that they would be satisfied with a condition limiting the number of persons to 50. Council officers agree that that's acceptable. It's been demonstrated through the reporting that's been submitted to be acceptable. It would then be on the operators of the use, if this is approved and does commence, be on the operators of the use to ensure compliance. And it would be available for residents to make complaints if they perceive more than 50 people on site, which council may investigate.
Councillor Carol Taylor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This is an area I'm very familiar with. And through you to the planners, the use, again, it's a bit like Councillor James's, proposed to be capped at 50 people. Now, how is the compliance going to work on that? Do you know, how is that going to happen? Again, I've got a comment here about the car parks, but My main comment really is about the traffic assessment, and while we've accepted a traffic assessment that was done in 2017, increased traffic numbers since then, including, as has been pointed out by the submitters, the school buses have gone from 1 to 3. Now, there won't be school buses on a Sunday, I take that, but the traffic has increased there. There actually are times when you're trying to turn onto the New England Highway without any of this that you can't, that you have to wait for quite some time, or if you've got local knowledge, you can go back around over to the Preston Boundary Road. So I do have concerns about that. And then another question, if I might, is this facility going to be allowed to be used outside those hours, i.e. rented, loaned, whatever, to other groups? Because it's only used on Sunday morning and Monday afternoon. So is the ability there for this to be used like many of the other facilities that we have in our areas, and that, you know, the ballet or someone else or something else? I don't see anything here prohibiting that. So this is being approval is being sought for a place of worship, but is there anything in there that stops this facility from being rented out to other groups outside those hours? Thank you.
So, Councillor, is the two questions, one, what the traffic report, and the, and then that, and is it available at any other times? Yeah.
And Madam Chair, I mean, we know how our community's grown in 6 years. A traffic assessment that was done handed and dated 2017 was probably begun in 2016, and we're now at 2023, and our traffic has changed dramatically since then.
So, thank you. Chris, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll offer the planner's answer as best I can, and then I might call on the engineers to come and fill in the gaps, if that's okay, Clint. So the traffic survey was done in 2017, you're correct, Councillor? Yes, and the traffic impact assessment actually added a growth factor to that to account for the growth anticipated to have occurred between 2017 and 2023. And then they started with a base year of 2023 on the presumption that the development may be approved and may be operating this year, and gave a 10-year design horizon up to 2033. So the traffic impact assessment was assessed by council's engineers and considered to be acceptable. It was also, this is a state-controlled road. The New England Highway is a state-controlled road, and that's correct, Councillor. So the state has jurisdiction over the state-controlled road and the intersections with the state-controlled road. I might, before answering the second part of your question, Councillor, I might ask our engineers if they have anything they'd like to add in regards to traffic and the traffic reporting.
Thank you, through the chair.
You'll need to speak into the microphone, Clint, just so that everyone listening online can hear. You don't have to lean down to it. Just pop it up on that,
right.
on the edge there.
It's acknowledged that the original traffic counts were undertaken 5 or 6 years ago, and as Chris has mentioned, a linear growth factor has been applied to bring it up to approximately 2023, and therefore it's assessed on today's terms. Another consideration, as Chris mentioned, is that the highway is state controlled, but fundamentally the use itself is only generating, if at 50 occupants at maximum, you're looking at only 20 cars, potentially a few more at maximum. So over the course of a peak hour, you're looking at only one car every couple of minutes.
If I could just make a comment there, I'm really not worried about the Sunday, sorry. It's the Monday I'm worried about, and that road does carry traffic from Preston Peak out that way. Some come back that way to go to the south, so it's often busy at peak hours.
Yes, thank you, through the chair. New England High State Control, it's always busy. Oh yes. So in terms of the afternoon sessions, sorry.
Sorry, Bewley Drive.
Yep. In terms of the local road network, the afternoon sessions, traffic starting the use at 5 or 6 p.m. That's during the peak hour, but the use is leaving the site will be that. So it's considered that whilst the use and the peak hour traffic are aligned, it's still within operational limits.
Councillor Bonhoff, did you have a question for Clint? Okay, we might go to that and then I'll go to you, Councillor.
Thank you.
Don't go too far away, Clint. Sounds like you
I
might
have
be
to
needed.
thank you for your reply. I'm not sure I agree with it. Thanks.
Councillor, through the chair, in terms of whether this site can be used, if you have a look at condition 89, that condition limits all activities on the site to between the hours of 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. for Sunday services and 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. for Monday prayer meetings. No other activities on that site are to occur outside of those hours unless otherwise approved in writing by council.
Thank you very much. I missed that. I do apologise. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Councillor McMahon?
Well, thanks, Chair. I do have about 3 questions. Traffic wasn't so much my concern. I wonder if the council park across the road and down 200 metres has 50 people in 3 hours on a Monday. I think it's pretty standard. But first question is around the plumbing. Noting that this site isn't on council's plumbing system, and on the map you had before, there was an existing sewerage system on the site, just in where the car park is, holding tank. So the premises that was there was a standard house, and this is going to 50 people. Is the existing sewerage system adequate to hold the increase in people, and is that something you've talked about?
Councillor, through the chair, a conceptual sewage treatment plan was provided by the applicant to demonstrate how sewage would work on site. It has been, I believe it was upgraded, but it has now got a treatment tank where on-site sewage is treated before it is then transferred over to a sewage treatment where it is then transferred over to a holding tank, which will then be collected. And this will be subject to a plumbing approval as well.
Thanks. So overall, you're happy with that? I'm happy with that. I wanted to talk about the idea of community use, which is part of putting this in the zone it's in. Obviously, a church is a community use. Does it and should it come into play when you have another one of the same denomination 700 metres away? Does the amount of churches in an area change the council officer perspective of community use?
Councillor, through the chair, no, it does not change the definition of community use. That isn't based on different set numbers or anything like that. It is just sort of a collective group definition.
Easy one. My final one, look, I got to say, at first I thought if I had neighbours who were home 6 hours a week, that'd be a pretty good deal, and there's a big hedge around the front. But then I did look at 6 to 9 a.m. on a Sunday, and then 5 to 8 on a Monday. And I don't know if you know the answer to this, or perhaps when we hear from Mr. Kelly undoubtedly soon, there are churches that have a congregation and there are churches that have rock bands. And I suppose I'd like to know which one this fits into and what sort of music is played at 6 a.m. on a Sunday.
Councillor, through the chair, that will have to be something that the applicant will be required
Yeah,
to
thanks very
answer.
much. I'll look forward to asking that then. No, they're all my questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Summerfield?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for the report. On that map that's up there now, I got really confused by that because it's got Hillview Court on the right-hand side there, and shouldn't that be Bewley Drive?
Yes, so
Doesn't Schmid Court become Hillview Court when it crosses over Bewley Drive?
I believe on mapping it does become Hillview across, and on mapping it is shown as Bewley Drive. Yes, that's correct. No.
So sorry, it should be Bewley Drive or it shouldn't?
It should be Bewley Drive based on mapping.
Thank you. I think it's important. So if we could go to Board Books 53, the flood overlay map, could you talk me through that more, please, given there's a big blue line fair along the part of the allot, please?
Sure, Councillor, through the chair. So essentially that big blue line through the centre shows the different levels of flood risk. So they're all located along that western side of the site. There's the green hatching over the top, which also shows a vulnerable uses restriction area. Essentially, in that flood hazard overlay code, there's a bunch of requirements that certain development have to meet if they are proposing development within that area. However, the church is located fully outside of that flood hazard area.
Okay, so it is on the block, but it's just not, the building's not going to be in that particular part of it.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. So then on Board Books page 6, the second last paragraph, it talks about an access strip with a width of 0.1 metre wide in favour of TRC located between the site and the New England Highway. 0.1 metre would be, is that what it is? You serious?
Yes, that's correct. It's they normally put in to restrict access, not for any use, but just to restrict access between the site and the highway, and that's why it is so small.
Wow.
And councillors,
Can't even put a pipe in it.
through the chair, councillors, I could add as well that access restriction strips are a legacy issue. It was a way to manage which properties could gain access to which roads, and they're not able to be imposed
the
now.
highway.
So this is a legacy issue, but it's still an issue that needs to be dealt with, and the applicant has dealt with that by taking access from the local road network.
Well, it's probably good in respect to this because it stops people trying to access the highway directly. Thank you. So then, what else did I have? Can you explain to me how a meeting place is compatible with low intensity residential character, please?
Sure. So essentially there's a few items in there which relate to how it can be low intensity. One, you've got the scale. So the scale of the use and operations being maxed out at 50 people is consistent with other non-residential uses within the rural zone, specifically that church to the north, which we discussed earlier, which is also maxed out at a capacity of 50 people. You also have the size of the building itself. So this one being a small single-storey building of only 148 metres squared is significantly smaller than other houses within the street as well. The other component to it is the amenity and its ability to ensure that residential amenity is maintained within the area with regard to noise, for example, and traffic, that sort of thing. And the applicant has provided the noise impact assessment and traffic impact assessment, which has demonstrated that the proposed operation of the use should not impact any residential amenity.
Yeah, see, I see that if I was someone who was buying a large block of land there, you're doing it for your isolation and low traffic movements and that nice tranquil country living. Not putting a church in there that 50 people are going to rock up to a couple of times a week. And, you know, as has been explained, that can easily be 40 plus cars. I just don't see how the sins of the past of a previous church being placed out there means that it's suitable. Anyway, that's just my point of view on that one. The other thing was we talked about the hours of use, which is 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. on Sundays, and I'm assuming that means that they can arrive at 6 a.m. to prepare for a service, not that the service starts at 6 a.m. Because that would mean people coming even earlier, and it's Sunday morning, which is when people generally get the opportunity to sleep in. I'm just wondering, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Sundays and 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. Mondays, they are restricted to those times wholesome, or that's the time the service is being held?
Councillor, through the chair, the condition has been worded so that all on-site activities are restricted to those times.
Okay, thank you. So then one last question on that, and that is, someone asked potential for it to have an additional use, that it could be hired out to somebody else for some other, whether it be dance or whatever, just meetings or whatever it may be. And we were told that that would have to come back to council they would have to apply for the additional use. So given the concerns that have been raised about the hours here today, would any additional use of that hall come back to the council for approval, or would that just be an officer sign-off?
Thank you, Councillor. Through the chair, there are a number of factors that may be considered. If someone has an approval and they're seeking to change the conditions or the parameters of the approval, a significant change is possibly going to come back before the councillors for a vote. A minor change is possibly something that would be considered by council officers under delegation. It would really come down to the nature and extent of the proposed change. An impact assessable change, so if for example, if this development application were approved today by council and the operation started, and in a number of years there are some additional uses or expectations from the congregation that are proposed, if that required a minor change to the development permit in order to facilitate those changes, it is quite likely that it would be considered by council officers under delegation. If it was not a minor change as defined under the Act, it would be in all likelihood an other change, which is likely to be impact assessable, depending on the planning scheme in effect at the date of the change. So the answer, I'm afraid, today, Councillor, is it's not clear at this time.
Thank you. Councillor Bonhoff.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Through you, I've got a couple of questions. I might start with one that Councillor Taylor raised, so potentially Clint. It relates to something that he said earlier. So I'm curious about the interpretation of the performance outcome and the acceptable outcome. Clint, with what you were talking about, I'm not talking about the New England Highway. What I'm going to say relates only to Bewley Drive and Schmidt Court. And I'm curious about your interpretation because the performance outcome, PO15, says that non-residential uses are located on major roads and do not introduce non-residential traffic into local streets. And then the acceptable outcome, AO 15.1, is that non-residential uses have frontage and vehicle access to a regional, arterial, subarterial or distributor road, and vehicle access to the development does not occur from a local street. Now, your commentary just now, and also the commentary in the report, is that it is noted that it doesn't comply, this application does not comply, but that the traffic impact assessment demonstrates that traffic volumes generated by the proposed development along Schmidt Court and Bewley Drive are significantly under the expected traffic volumes associated with the road hierarchy for each road. And I can't understand how that comment speaks at all to the performance outcome or the acceptable outcome, AO 15.1 or PO 15.
Thank you, through the Chair. So notwithstanding what the performance outcome says, it is a public road. So a semi-trailer can drive down that road as of right. Notwithstanding that, the performance outcome does, I guess, general terms prohibits certain vehicles for certain uses. However, fundamentally, the road still operates as intended. It's a public road and within operational limits.
I'll speak to that one when we go into debate then, Madam Chair. Thank you. Thanks, Clint, for that. My next question, Emily, thank you for the report. Through you, Madam Chair. So, Emily, you've mentioned a couple of times in response to councillors' questions that the proposed development application is consistent. It's a rural residential zone, and it's consistent, you've said a couple of times, with other existing uses in the area. Now, other than that, the church, the other Plymouth Brethren place of worship, what are the other consistent existing uses in the area?
Councillor, through the chair. So it is consistent with that other church in terms of consistency in terms of the scale of the building. It's consistent with other housing within the area as well. So non-residential uses are allowed in the zone provided that they are small scale. So essentially that comment about the scale is basically to confirm that it is consistent with the scale of other non-residential uses in the area, being that church, which is maxed at that 50 capacity. So it's consistent with the small scale. It should be considered small scale as it is consistent with that church.
Okay, thanks, Emily. I will again come back to that point. Madam Chair, then to pick up also on what Emily just said, about the consistency of scale, looking at that aerial map, and I note the comments in the report, there's comments that the parking is consistent in scale with surrounding areas. Now, when I look at that aerial, I can't see any other residential places that have 21 car parks and room for 28 additional. So can we please help us understand how the determination's been made that the scale of the parking is consistent?
Thank you, Councillor. Through the chair. When an application like this is made, it is assessed through the impact assessment process. We weigh up a number of factors, including the acceptable outcomes listed, which can be quite prescriptive, and the performance outcomes, which tend to be a little more flexible. And then beyond the performance outcomes, if something doesn't immediately comply with the performance outcome, we then elevate to see what the overall outcomes of the code say, what the purpose of the code says. Then if something is not clearly consistent with those, we have access to the strategic framework of the planning scheme. If we step outside of the planning scheme, apart from things like the state planning policy, we have access to the purpose of the Planning Act, advancing the purpose of the Planning Act, where we conduct a balancing exercise. So whenever we're doing an impact accessible assessment, we're starting with the details and we're looking for consistency. Everywhere we get consistency, we can tick and move on. Everywhere we have inconsistency, we take a broader assessment against a higher order criteria. In this case, you pointed out some issues with the performance outcomes. I'll read performance outcome 1 of the zone code. This may speak somewhat to your question. The zone accommodates very low density forms of housing and other small scale uses that service the day-to-day needs of local residents. So this at 148 square metres of building, accommodating 50 patrons or 50 worshippers with a sealed car parking space of 21 spaces, in my view, clearly meets this performance outcome. If we look back at performance outcome 15, which you referred to in one of your previous questions, with the acceptable outcome AO 15.1. So AO 15.1 says, non-residential uses have frontage and vehicle access to a regional arterial, sub-arterial or distributor road, and vehicle access to the development does not occur from a local street. It doesn't do that. So clearly then we have to look at the higher order criteria. PO15, non-residential uses are located on major roads and do not introduce non-residential traffic into local streets. It doesn't comply with that performance outcome. So we then consider it against the higher order criteria, and in this case we've looked at overall outcomes. Overall outcome G of the Rural Residential Zone Code. It's on page 28 in the report I'm looking at. Now, the Rural Residential Zone allows non-residential uses to be established within the rural residential zone, provided that the use meets the day-to-day convenience needs of the residential catchment in the zone, are compatible with the semi-rural and low-intensity residential character of the zone, and do not impact the amenity of surrounding land uses. The assessment has been undertaken, and it's been determined that this proposal with 148 square metres of building, 21 odd car parks in an impervious car parking arrangement plus some overflow does meet that scale and intensity. And you're correct in that it'd be very unlikely to find a house in this area with 21 car parking spaces. So it will be different in built form in that regard. It will be nonetheless of a similar scale and form. And some of those hard elements like the car parking that may in some cases have a detrimental impact on the streetscape will be screened with landscaping to the local street. So the assessment has been undertaken, and it's been determined that this is consistent with the expected built form of this particular zone.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you for that. I would say that there is a very strong argument to be made to accept that 148 square metres of floor space is consistent, but 21 car parks with formed car parks with space for another 28 for overflow, that's not consistent. And then with respect, I appreciate your assessment of the day-to-day needs of local residents. However, we do have 175 local residents objecting, and potentially they might be best placed to make an assessment about the day-to-day needs of their community. And that goes to that higher order planning scheme that you're speaking to. So anyway, we'll get into that, I suppose, later on this afternoon. But Madam Chair, I just have one final question, if I might.
Best kind questions.
It's probably to Luke, because if Luke is the Senior Environment Officer who endorsed the noise impact assessment. Oh, okay. Okay. Just getting the relevant AO and PO up here. So, apologies, here we go. So this relates to PO 11 and AO 11.2. So we've got that there's the performance outcome says that hours of operation are controlled so that the non-residential use does not impact on the amenity or privacy of adjoining residential uses. And the acceptable outcome 11.2 is that non-residential uses, except for shop and food outlet, do not create audible noise between the hours of 7 p.m. and 6 a.m. So my questions are, we've got in the conditions that the prayer meetings will be held between 5 and 8 p.m. on Mondays, and that to me is outside the 7 p.m. cutoff. So that part of the condition I'd like to understand. And then also it says that don't create audible noise, and so that prayer meeting on a Monday evening, and it might be a question that the applicant can answer if we can't, but I mean, is that prayer meeting led? And presumably if it is, it's with a microphone. and so it has that noise assessment wasn't included in our board pack, but the work that was done on those sensitive receptors, did that take into account worship being led, prayer meetings being led with microphones? Is there singing involved on that Monday night? And why, when the AO talks about a 7 p.m. cut-off, have we conditioned it to 8 p.m?
Thank you for the question, Councillor, through the chair. So just to comment on the use or proposed use of the site. The noise report was based on replica modelling of a similar site on agreement with council officers. And if I can draw your attention to condition 93 of the conditions of approval, the use of amplified devices must be managed in accordance with section 7 of the approved noise impact assessment. And essentially within section 7, amplified music and speech are to be managed as to be not to be audible at neighbouring dwellings.
That's right. That's why I'm asking the question, I guess. And in particular, audible noise is specifically articulated in that acceptable outcome with that 7 p.m. cut-off.
Yes, well, given that the application is impact accessible, council officers have access to any relevant matter within the planning scheme. So this was also assessed under Performance Outcome 8 of the Environmental Standards Code, which sets very specific noise limits for a development to comply with in order to ensure that a noise nuisance is not created. And the applicant did provide a noise impact assessment complete with background monitoring of a replica site as a base model for the noise assessment which council officers accepted. And based on the modelled results, the predicted noise limits at all sensitive receptors were well below the assessment criteria that were required.
And did we get to the bottom of the 8 p.m?
Yeah, so we can see in the acceptable outcome that the hours are limited between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m. in creating audible noise. But I can also draw your attention to the performance outcome which we deem that the applicant has met, and that it does not impact on the amenity or privacy of adjoining residential users, and this has been demonstrated by the noise impact assessment.
Okay, that's it for now. Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Carol Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just on that, the hours on a Sunday, I think ordinary hours on a Sunday, 6 a.m. is, I think it's 7 or 7:30 on a Sunday, isn't it? So 6 a.m. and I'm concerned about this. That's when the church service starts. People have to drive to get there before 6 a.m. But one of the questions I forgot to ask, one of the questions I forgot to ask, in there it says one male toilet and one female toilet. Will that be picked up through the building code once the building's built? Because I actually happen to remember when Cafe Forte and Verazion were over here in Margaret Street, and they were both very popular venues, and they had one toilet for everyone who used those two facilities. One toilet. So one toilet, male and female, for 50 people, and I suggest there's possibly children as well as that. So I just probably need assurance through you that that's going to be picked up by the building code.
Councillor, through the chair, yes, that will be picked up through the building code.
Can I also ask, back to that question, what are the noise rules on a Sunday? Because I don't believe they include 6 a.m. on a Sunday.
Councillor, through the chair. So I'll draw your attention back to the conditions I noted before. Conditions 93 and 94. So 93 restricts the use of amplified devices. They must be managed to not be audible at sensitive receptors as per section 7 of the approved noise impact assessment. And also doors and windows are to remain closed during times of worship. And these were assumptions within the noise model which was accepted by council officers.
And thank you for that, but my concerns about cars coming and going, talking out in the car park, doors closing and all that sort of thing which happens when there's a group of people at any particular area, at that time. So if the church service starts at 6 a.m, there'll be noise out in the car park prior to that.
Councillor, through the chair, yes, you're correct. And within the noise impact assessment, there were two main criteria of noise sources that were included. That was the indoor breakout noise from the place of worship itself and exterior noise based on car movements, doors slamming, people talking. And these inputs and their relative sound power levels were deemed acceptable, and the model results showed that the noise limits were compliant.
Thank you. Councillor Carr?
Thanks, Chair. Do we know how many of the church members are in fact local residents? Maybe the applicant can answer that later, because if, you know, further along the line of meeting the needs of local local residents or local community, I hazard a guess. I'm eager to hear. It might be proportionally significantly more that are actually not part of the local residents. I'll wait to hear. The other thing is, and I want to go back to the car parking. You know, we hear about noise, not the POs, not meeting the POs, needs of the local area, traffic assessment, and Chris, through the chair, I appreciate the framework that you apply. Other relevant matters, I was waiting for that one to be mentioned under MCU. Given that the application is in perpetuity and it's not about the owner, it's about the land, I think personally I would be much more comfortable, and I get why the applicant would put this out transparently in the plan. If we go to that site plan again, the 28 additional overflow car parks, given that the application goes with the land, it's in perpetuity, it can be handed on, sold on to another entity, similar type use, the impacts immediately could change around traffic and the use of that overflow car park in the future. I'd be much more comfortable if that wasn't designated as overflow car park, nor those lines signified, because that's a licence for the next owner of this premise to actually utilise. I think we probably need to think long term about these in my view, conflicting land uses and activities adjacent to an established rural residential neighbourhood. Anyway, if we need to debate that one, we can, but I would be much more comfortable and to hear from the applicant as well if they're amenable to actually, you know, if we've got a car parking requirement and we've asked for that, I don't see the need for actually designating over and above and beyond that. Other applicants put an application in and we ask for a minimum car park requirement, but we don't proceed beyond that and say, well, here's an overflow that could be utilised. I understand
about that, or did you want the applicant to comment on that, Chris?
And I understand your comments about single parent families or single occupant, but it's not about the actual owner now. It's in perpetuity. The application goes with the land.
Thank you, Councillor, for the question. I will remind councillors that the fastest growing households in Australia are lone households. So I would not be surprised if people, there were single sort of occupants in cars. The second thing is, even if there was a sale of the land, the conditions of approval would be attached to that land. So they would not be able to use it for any other purpose or expand the conditions unless they sought approval.
Yeah, that's exactly why I'm asking, and when the applicant's representative has an opportunity to address it, that's exactly why I'm asking if the applicant would be amenable to not actually designating that on a site plan that we will approve that could be used, in fact, for way above the maximum or minimum requirement of car parking under our town planning scheme. Because it could be a very similar use, but it could be utilised by a different entity or organisation that takes on this development as an existing as of right use.
Thank you, Councillor. I can probably offer some comments in response to that. The application that's before you now with a recommendation to approve subject to conditions, if it is approved and it's enacted, the approval and the conditions attached to the approval will continue to apply no matter who operates the use. So the limitation of 50 persons will continue to apply. I perceive that you may be concerned that there's an anticipated future application to expand the congregation based on the additional car parking, the informal car parking, and that may be a matter that you could put to the applicant for a bit of clarity.
Yeah, it's even beyond that. I mean, it allows a future owner the flexibility because it's actually designated that, look, you guys approved it back in such and such for overflow car parking. It's not so much to do with the numbers of persons on the site because it's a post condition from application that needs to be policed, and therefore it has an impact. So what I'm saying, an impact on council being able to police that takes time and money and resource to do that, and it's based on a reactive complaint. I'm saying let's mitigate that possibility right up front and remove that, and that could be designated something else in the site plan that we approve rather than indication of additional car parks. I'm just saying there's an opportunity for us to mitigate ongoing potential complaints about numbers of people exceeding the 50 persons, and we've approved there the very likelihood of that happening. And we've got to deal with a reactionary complaint in perpetuity, potentially.
Thank you, Councillor. I may just defer to the applicant if they would like to speak to that. I would add that Council does have the ability to seek to impose alternative conditions to the ones in the officer's report. So if there's a very strong will in the room to modify some of the draft conditions, we can certainly take that on board and consider drafting things now.
Councillor McDonald.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. Thanks for the report. On page 42 of board books, references in regard to the acoustic amenity general and the timings that are clearly set out. Condition 90 talks about service vehicle movements between the hours of 7 a.m. to 6 p.m, which are inconsistent in some regard to the 6 a.m. start. I'm just wondering what the definition of a service vehicle might be, and would that be on days other than the Sunday and the Monday? That's the first question.
Councillor, through the chair, so service vehicles in this case are likely just to be for refuse collection and effluent disposal, so picking up that effluent from those on-site tanks. So those would be able to occur outside those hours of operation, being that 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. on Sundays and 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. on Mondays.
Thank you. I was just clarifying what that service vehicle might be. When you talk about, through you, Madam Chair, through to Chris, you mentioned in regard to perhaps amending a condition or adding a condition. The amenity of the area is obviously clearly important from the submitters in regard to hours of operation, the time that they're there, and the numbers of people that are in the congregation, noting it's gone from 110 to 50. I'm just wondering whether, and you talked about a minor or a major change and determining whether that would come back to council. From a protection process, and I think it was Councillor Nancy actually who asked the question, is it something we could condition that a change in opening or change in hours of operation and or a change in numbers attending would trigger a major change and therefore require a council decision?
Thank you, Councillor. Through the Chair, it would not be possible to condition those obligations in a development approval. The tests will be undertaken at the relevant time. So if someone actually gains an approval, commences the use, or even gains the approval before commencing the use, then seeks to change any conditions, council officers will undertake an assessment against a number of criteria established by the Planning Act and the DA rules for the thing called the substantially different test. So it's not possible to condition that certain things will or won't be a minor or other change, and it's not possible to condition that certain types of matter must be brought before council to be considered. Council officers are quite sensitive to applications with strong community interest, so we would certainly be very aware that changes proposed, if this development is approved, changes proposed after the fact would be considered very carefully, and the decision-making authority would be considered very carefully.
Okay, thanks, Chris. In regard to the car parking, with the additional car parks on the grass, there's a condition in here. Is there a condition about no on-street car parking?
There is a condition requiring no on-street car parking and also requiring no parking signs to be established by the developer.
Okay. So therefore, if the GM's commentary around the statistics of lone households or vehicles, then that could provide a challenge if there's only 21 car parks. That's what that condition's there for.
But certainly, if there's 21 formalised sealed car parking spaces on site and 28 informal, or the plans say at least 28, it's effectively a grassed area with some possible line marking established by one of the conditions. If council sought to reduce the grassed informal or semi-formal parking space through changes in the ultimate decision and resolution, that may complicate the congregation's use of the site, particularly if there are single resident households or a significant number of single resident households. Certainly 50 people could quite easily exceed 21 vehicles.
Thanks.
Can I ask a hypothetical question? When we talk about uses that have local need, so that I think from past applications that we've had, that includes things like vets, childcare, hairdressers, physiotherapists, that sort of thing. Does say if it was an application for a vet surgery, you'd have less car parks but more numbers of people coming, wouldn't you? Possibly. So that sort of thing would be considered even in this rural zone?
These are all things that are considered in these types of applications, and you'll see there's reference in the assessment report to an acceptable outcome and performance outcome in the Rural Residential Zone Code, which lists a number of uses which are anticipated to occur in the rural residential zone. Some of those are things like vets, the small scale developments that can be done in a form that fits with the local residential community. You would see similarities in the rural residential zone as you would with the urban residential zones, the low, medium density and the low density residential zones. There is an expectation built into the planning scheme that those areas are for dwellings, for people to live, but there's also an expectation that small scale uses that are going to fit in with that local built form and not have unreasonable adverse impacts on the residential amenity of the area are acceptable. So we look through some acceptable outcomes and some performance outcomes, and we see some inconsistencies, but as we travel our way up to the higher order criteria in the planning scheme, we see consistency and support for small scale commercial or non-residential uses in rural res and residential zones when they're done at an appropriate scale and managing their impacts well.
Councillor Carl's got a further question. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, just a point of clarification on the car parking. I'm not suggesting that the applicant doesn't use it. What I am suggesting is that we don't approve a site plan that seems to fly in the face, that seems to be inconsistent with the minimum car parking requirement for the application. I'm saying we need to leave that up to the discretion of the applicant what they use that land for, but I'm not comfortable to designate it as overflow car parking beyond the life of this applicant because it's in perpetuity, the application. It seems to work against, it is inconsistent with the 50-person limit imposed on this application when we're prepared to provide car parking or approve formal and informal collectively, which is potentially way above, despite I'm not prepared to accept that the majority of the congregation would be single person attendees for any stretch of the imagination. I'm saying that we probably need to be consistent in our own approval that it mitigates the chance in the future of the question being put back to us. Well, hang on, there's this amount of car parks that you've approved originally, despite a 50-person. It waters down the argument is what I'm saying. Leave that up to the applicant to manage, because if they don't manage it without the designation and the potential impact for us for the next owner of this facility, because we don't know whether that'll change or not. After all, this congregation has obviously saw fit to build another one in very close proximity down the road. So we don't know what happens in the future. So that's all. I'm just saying let's be consistent and mitigate potential. But I'm keen to hear from the applicant if they're willing to do that.
Thank you, Councillor. I will point out that the planning scheme establishes minimum car parking requirements. So the sealed car parking requirements meet the minimum requirements of the planning scheme, and the extra car parking as overflow is informal or semi-formal. If council has a really strong will to limit the informal car parking, it could certainly consider that, discuss that in debate, and we could possibly draft a condition this afternoon. I would just be mindful that that may have some significant adverse impacts on the operation of the use. If we have 50 worshippers turning up for a service, and they arrive in 30 cars, we've got no on-street car parking through the conditions.
Well, maybe when we get to debate, Councillor Carr, you might like to propose what you...
I just need to address that with the officer. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm suggesting rather than hard lines on a plan that give us specific designation that seems to be inconsistent with our 50-person limit, that we merely leave it as an open area, undesignated. They can still use it for off-street car parking, but I'm not comfortable to designate it because the application is in perpetuity and it's leveraged down the track for it to be, well, you guys approved this for car parking despite numbers which could be considered a minor change and not come to council, and then we're managing a bigger problem down the track. I just cite, I could just, there are a number of instances where the tin gets kicked down the road and we deal with bigger problems because we haven't probably tried to mitigate the potential.
Well, we'll get the applicant to comment on that when Paul comes up to speak. We've got one last question from Councillor Shine, and then we'll go to the submitter.
No, thanks, Chair. I just, officers, you'd be aware, as being residents of Toowoomba, some cases for long term, no doubt, that there are numerous churches within the city boundary, and I suggest that a lot of them are situated closer to residents than this proposed site, and a lot of them with fewer car parks than this proposed site. Would that be correct from your observation?
Councillor, through the chair, yes, there would be a number of churches that are in town with less car parks, just in general speaking.
And closer to residents? Next door, in fact.
It can be next door, but this one is as well next door to dwelling houses too.
And Councillor, through the chair, I would add that a lot of places of worship established throughout the Toowoomba region would have been established before planning controls had limitations. So what we're dealing with now is somewhat similar in the regard that it is a place of worship in a residential area close to existing houses. It's different in that we now have the ability to assess, consider if it's acceptable, and to impose conditions to limit impacts on the surrounding residents. So in that regard, it's quite different.
Okay. Councillor Taylor, did you have a question?
I've just got one last question. Why, when the noise hours in Australia are between 8 a.m. on Sundays and 7 p.m. on Sundays, are we allowing this from 6 a.m. on a Sunday in a neighbourhood?
Yeah, Councillor, through the chair. As I discussed in response to another question previously, the application has met the performance outcome of not creating an audible noise at sensitive receptors during those hours outside the hours in the acceptable outcome.
Thank you, but I don't know how you pull a car up, shut the door, get out and walk without making any noise, and multiply that by 20. Thanks.
Okay, with that, Jeff Reid is here to present for the submitters, and he is the principal petitioner of one petition. Jeff, you get about 5 minutes, but unless you're really going over.
Hi, I'm Jeff Reid, a long-term resident of 8 Schmidt Court, Top Camp. So that's since 2008. The proposed development is directly across the road from my home. I would like to acknowledge the Mayor, Councillors, CEO and other members. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners whose land we meet on today and their elders past, present and future. My wife and I decided to move to Toowoomba with our young family because it was a great place for families and a community spirit. We have been extensively involved in the community, where currently I volunteer on the Council's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Committee, Toowoomba NAIDOC Committee, and on the board of Emerge Toowoomba. I'm all for religious freedom and openly support people of different faiths and beliefs. Being a First Nation person gives me an understanding on this, and I'm always compassionate of others. I don't want to focus on the reports, but the lived experiences in and around the street. The first we heard of the development was when the house was put on the back of a large truck in 2021. There was no consultation, no forward discussions around the plans for the street. While I'm not an engineer, damage occurred to my driveway and to council assets such as the curb, which now has 5 large cracks in place. Just imagine a house on the back of a large truck and trailer going over the footpath. I'm just not sure if council was aware of that. Schmidt Court is a small cul-de-sac consisting of 7 residential blocks with a diverse range of families. Approval of this development will mean that our quiet residential street will be nearly 15% non-residential and will greatly impact the amenity of the street and surrounds. Our street in particular, our front yard, used to be the meeting place for all the school buses. This was later moved to the corner of our street, also adjacent to the proposed development. In addition, there are children and grandchildren in the street that will be impacted by not being able to play close to the cul-de-sac or to walk to council parks. We currently have no footpaths, and walking on the once quiet road will be a new risk to them. Meeting every Sunday morning, 52 weeks a year, at 6 a.m. will be a huge impact. I understand they claim that they'll be quiet, but that is a hard claim to keep. We currently hear cars drive up and down our quiet street during the day, so there is a strong possibility that we will hear it on a Sunday morning. This will be a greater impact in summer as we have our windows open because we're environmentally conscious and noise will travel into our home. The intersection adjoining the development with the highway is not safe and it's not designed for multiple vehicles. Whenever I turn there, I change my speed in advance so that I don't need to stop on the highway while waiting to turn. It is already designated as a high crash zone, and I'm concerned that if you approve this application, and God forbid there is an accident or a death, some of the blame could fall back on you for approving it as you have been warned about this. As per the application, the applicant confirms that there is another church nearby. Actually, it is less than 600 metres away in a nearby street. An easy walk and as per Google, a 1-minute drive. A senior member of the church told me that their congregation in Top Camp in Hodgson Vale was growing and is currently well over 100. That their model is to construct a new church for every 50 people. Now this is a personal one-to-one conversation, not hearsay. I fear that their wants and not a need will set an alarming precedent. Currently, there are many churches in the Toowoomba area where their congregation are happy to travel short and or long distances to practice their faith while balancing the needs of others. Often these congregations show compassion to others and try to work together. In wrapping up, I would like to raise the application is full of generalised terms. I hope your approval have the right conditions and safeguards so that the community are not impacted by your decisions. As I mentioned, this development is in the wrong place and is based on the wants and not the needs of the applicant, where the impacts far outweigh the benefits. They already have a church close by. If they want another one, it should have been proposed in a street designed for traffic away from houses. There are a lot of sites available in the area, but maybe too expensive. However, this one is not safe or suitable. As a tax and ratepayer, I started a petition against the development. The rules of the paper-based petition meant that that doing this during COVID made it hard for people to confirm their support. And then unfortunately, hundreds missed out on signing it. We did get 140 responses in total in the end, but I just wanted to make you aware of the true level of your constituents not in favour of this development, who will be notified of your response to this decision. Does the council want to create a community where the wants of a few override the needs of many? The development is in the wrong place and not right for the street and surrounding areas. Am I allowed to pose some questions or I can't? Or do I pose them as a statement?
I think, yes, maybe as a statement.
So one statement I just wanted to say was, if someone does a noise assessment on themselves, I may have understood this incorrectly, so if they say at our other site, we'll do a noise assessment, how could that not be a conflict? I just want to confirm that no vehicles can enter the property prior to 6 a.m, because that's the way I took it. And if this gets approved, the Top Camp Hodgson Vale area will have 2 churches, both of the same denomination. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Jeff. Just stay there for a second. We might have some questions for you. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, through you, do you know how many locals, and by locals I mean in that area, are part of this church?
I think there's quite a few.
How many?
Well, as per my discussions with the church, well over 100.
So my concern is that, you know, in that little locality, and I know the area well, I used to be the mayor out there, so the street is not really, it's a neighbourhood street is what it is. And actually, you know, it's not meant to carry a whole lot of traffic. So my concern is the people living in that area, how many of them are there? You probably can't answer that, but according to the people that have put in submissions, there's quite a lot that don't support it.
That is
Thank
correct.
you.
I mean, it is a 7-house street. It's a cul-de-sac. It's a closed street. It's not a through street. It's not designed.
No, I understand
Yeah.
the street. I know it very well. The other thing is that, I mean, the houses can't, the cars can't go before 6, but the service starts at 6.
That was my understanding.
It's interesting, isn't it, where there's a noise limits on Sunday, say 8 a.m.
Okay, I don't think there's any further questions for you. Thank you very much, Jeff. Now, Paul Kelly from Precinct Urban Planning is going to come and present, and I think you've written down some of the queries and questions that people have. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, councillors, staff, the submitters, and also applicant representatives. Sorry. Can you hear me? Yes. I was going to do a bit of a presentation, but there's been a few matters have arisen, so I thought maybe best to use the time to try to respond to some of those. I think there was a reference there at the beginning about the scale of the development was going to be up to 110 people at this worship facility. The application, when it was proposed, showed that the regular weekly services would be for 50 people, and it was to propose to have 7 to 8 times in a year where it may go to 110. So that's why there was more car parking proposed for that scale. The church has met with council officers in responding to information requests and also submitter issues. As part of that, the church has consciously decided to bring it back to the 50 people, meeting twice weekly at a scale and operating hours that's consistent with others in the locality, including the one to the north. The car parking numbers, so just I guess on that, even though 21 sealed parks are proposed with an overflow parking area, the planning scheme for a place of worship use triggers the need for 15 car parks for a building of this size. As part of the information that was gathered to respond to council's information request, the applicant conducted their own parking surveys at a number of their other worship centres of sizes that are consistent with what is proposed here. Those parking surveys over quite a number of weekends showed that this development at 50 people would need 15 car parks. However, the church has consciously left it at the 21 sealed car parks that were proposed as part of the original application. The overflow parking has also remained. The church has just informed me now that they're happy not to show that on the approved plans, and I guess and in that regard I'll let officers and councillors debate that further. I suppose one of the things I just need to relate, I guess, with my experience with churches. I've done about 18 churches in the Toowoomba Regional Council area. Some of them are quite large and have been very contentious, like St Bart's and some of those, and some of them are quite small and have very little residential amenity impacts. I did do the approval for the one that is to the north of here, and I know that with any church application, when council officers are assessing those types of uses, regardless of whom may be the church denomination that is occupying the premises, as the General Manager mentioned before, these approvals attach to land. For a church use, one of the things you do have to take into account is that at some point there may be the need for a midweek funeral or something like that that's out of the ordinary, that you may want to see some areas left aside for overflow parking so that you're not taking up room on the street. When we've looked at various iterations of this design during the assessment of the application, one of the things that we did look at was how to, like there's been a few visitations on the on-site effluent disposal report that's been done. And that overflow parking area, Mr. Wendy, I'm just not sure if we could have a look at the site plan, which I don't know if it's attachment 5, I'm not sure. There, so that one there. So the overflow parking area, because, the New England Highway side of the allotment is a gully, and that's the part that's in the flood hazard overlay. So to keep all of the development outside of that overlay, where the overflow parking was shown, at one point that was proposed to be transpiration areas for on-site effluent. But at the point though where council was trying to ensure that there was some overflow parking areas, the on-site disposal system has been changed in its design, and it now involves a holding tank, a treatment facility to a holding tank fitted with a high pressure alarm when it reaches 5,000 litres, also equipped with a QR code in accordance with council's plumbing section, which then makes the facility able to be monitored by both council officers and the applicant in terms of its ongoing servicing. So the overflow parking, I guess what it did do was made sure that that area was not then going to be devoted to something where cars couldn't park in the future. But certainly the applicant has let it be known to me now that they're happy for the site plan to show that that is not an overflow parking area. In terms of scale, the development, as you can see there, the building is 148 square metres and it's got the 21 sealed car parks there. I do regularly deal with developments for even just dwelling houses in rural residential areas, particularly where the application's triggered through bushfire requirements and so on. When people buy blocks of this size, it is not unusual these days to build quite large homes on these properties. A 300 square metre home is not out of the ordinary, which is double the size of what's proposed here. And when they build a home of that size, they've generally got a 4 or 5 bay shed that's got a concrete apron in front of that shed for a circulation area. I don't really think the scale of the impervious area or the building is otherwise inconsistent what can occur in these areas based on my experience with what people make application for today. In terms of traffic movements, I do appreciate that we do have the two local streets to get access into the site. It was a conscious decision not to take access off Bewley Drive because it does have a very narrow frontage to the property, and so it was proposed to bring the access around to where the existing access was for the previous residents on that site. And the traffic assessment that was prepared and then revised for the purpose of this application was showing that at 50, a congregation of 50 meeting twice weekly was the equivalent of 21 vehicle movements per day as an average through the week. If we just take, for example, the house that was there, council operates on a vehicle per day movement number for a dwelling house of 10 vehicle movements per day. In this zone, under the dwelling house definition, a person can also make application for a secondary dwelling. So that's the new term now for what was relatives apartment or granny flat or whatever it may be. But having the ability to have a house and a secondary dwelling on this site could mean that you could have 20 vehicle movements per day on average here, and the church at 50 people twice a week is 21 vehicle movements per day. So in terms of traffic generation, traffic volumes, and what the area can otherwise be allowed to develop as, it really isn't that inconsistent with what can be there now. I think it's also important to point out, as I did experience when I did the development further to the north of here, a place of worship use on that site is code accessible under circumstances where the land does have frontage to a regional arterial, sub-arterial or distributor road. The New England Highway is a regional arterial road. For that reason, on the previous site, that application was code accessible. If an application is code accessible, it's a use envisaged by the council for the area. It is the presence of the 10 centimetre wide access restriction strips along the New England Highway frontage that meant that the property didn't have direct frontage to a regional arterial road. We sought legal advice on that matter after a pre-lodgement meeting with council, and the access restriction strips actually don't extend the full frontage. As you get closer to the truncated corner, the restriction strips cease. Our legal advice was that we could argue that the application would still be code accessible on that basis. However, we followed council's direction and went through an impact accessible process, just to show that we weren't trying to do anything out of the ordinary there. I think also sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. Oh, I guess just the questions about noise. So yes, we absolutely did do the noise impact assessment, which included noise modelling. The noise modelling is not something that you can easily manipulate at all. The council officers then have the ability to rigorously scrutinise that, which they've done. And when talking about audible noise, I guess, and this is not my area of expertise, but just with my experience, I've noticed that it's dealing with noise levels that are a certain number of decibels above background noise levels. So you may still have a property in a residential area, even a residential house, that will still generate background noise levels. What the noise impact assessments have to look at is a certain threshold above those background noise levels, which has been undertaken for this site and shown that with the recommendations, including all closing of all doors and windows during services, that will ensure that it shouldn't result in adverse impacts on residential amenity. That requirement of closing doors and windows is also something that I've seen on all the other church applications that I've done where it's been a new build. And so similar to this development here, it has a vestibule at the front of the property, which means there's a two-door system before you actually get into the worship area. So a person may open a door, the other doors are closed, that door's closed, they go into the other room where the worshipping occurs, and that vestibule then acts as a noise block, and that also assists in noise amenity control mitigation, or noise mitigation rather. Let me just something else. There was questions about. Certainly, I'd take the officers' comments too about the conditions limiting the hours of operation to be consistent with what was applied for. And also, yes, just the scale. So at a congregation of 50 people, there is the other facility to the north. And the applicant has also reinforced with me again today, having listened to the conversation, that the congregation for this facility are local families within the area. The original one that was built north of here was one that I did in 2013. Over that 10-year horizon, that congregation has grown. The church consistently likes to keep its worship facilities at 50 people. It even does that with the ones that are here in Toowoomba. And the natural growth of the congregation out in that area has meant that they're now looking for an alternate site. That will mean that this facility and the other facility continue to serve the day-to-day needs of the local community because they are actually made up of congregation members from residents in that local area. But look, honestly, since December 21, when we've had the pre-lodgement for this application, we've tried to work closely with the council officers at each step in the process, whether it be meeting with them before responding to information requests, before responding to submitter issues, further advice requests, the most recent being further information being sought about the on-site effluent disposal report for the site. We have consistently worked with council officers to address those requirements. We support the officer's assessment and the recommendations for the application to be approved subject to conditions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Paul. Questions? Councillor O'Shea?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Paul. I just want to clarify, so the cap, I suppose, it sits at 50 at a time. So you mentioned before that there was the possibility of, going back previously, that there could have been up to 110 or something, only 7 or 8 times a year.
Yes.
Mr. Reid, before, when he spoke before, said his understanding was there was over 100 or something in that area. So how's the 50 going to work?
Well, that part of it I can't comment on because I can only go on the advice that the applicant has given me. And right from the outset of this application, it's been because the facility is going to grow outside of its 50 for the other facility and the other worship facility. And they're trying to ensure that they've got another facility now that can be kept at 50 people. If they do escalate to those sort of numbers, like if the facility was kept at Top Camp Court and that went to 100 people or 150 or whatever it may be, that then has the potential to start generating adverse amenity impacts on those residents surrounding that facility. By keeping these facilities small and compact with compact congregation numbers, it's actually ensuring that they don't result in amenity impacts. I suppose one of the other things to think about too is places of worship are not the only non-residential use that this zone allows for. It does allow for a range of community uses like community halls, educational establishments, outdoor sport and recreation facilities. These things can happen by way of an application process. The difference with a place of worship though, compared to some of those others that the zone code allows you to have, is that a church normally would be code accessible here because of its proximity to a higher order road. And in this case, it's the presence of the 10 centimetre wide restriction strips that stop that.
Finish, Councillor O'Shea. Councillor Von Hoff, then Councillor.
Madam Chair, my question was much along the same lines as Councillor O'Shea's, because just to understand the numbers, because there was the 110, it's been revised down to 50, and to understand, and thank you, Paul, for answering the question about whether or not the church, the Brethren considered expanding its other location, existing location. And then, I mean, from what I'm hearing today, it almost sounds like and you might be able to answer this for us, a dense sort of group of Brethren live in this area. Is that the case? Or, yeah, is that the case?
Well, look, in terms, and I can certainly revert to the applicant in the room here, but just, I know, for example, when I was dealing with Top Camp Court, a congregation of 50 people back then may have only meant 5 or 6 families, even though that's, I know that we're talking 50 people, but they do tend to, by nature, have larger families.
Large families,
so
yep.
Therefore, the smaller church facilities are more of a neighbourhood type of facility that's servicing a lower number of families. And that's why I think they have gone down the path of just creating new neighbourhood hubs, for want of a better word, I guess, as a worship centre, as opposed to, you know, something like, I don't know, Hume Ridge that might have 1,100 people, or some of the churches that have really big facilities and auditoriums.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Thanks, Paul.
Councillor McDonald.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. Just in regard to, thank you, Paul, in regard to the times, the submitter mentioned and some clarification around 6 a.m. And does that mean that the service starts at 6 a.m. and people start to arrive before then, or does that mean that 6 a.m. is when residents can expect noise from people arriving?
I think the way I understand it to be, someone may arrive at 5 minutes before to open up the building, but it's the hours of operation is certainly something that they will adhere to. It's certainly something that's formed part of the application material, not just in the original application, but reinforced through responses to information requests and further advice requests, and also then formed the basis of the noise impact assessment and the noise modelling that was done as well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Councillor Carl.
Thanks, Chair. Hey, Paul, just so I'm clear in my mind, you mentioned up to 110 persons per year, up to 110 persons 7 to 8 times per year. So that, on average, would equate to once a month, less 4 months of the year. Yeah. So that's
what they
over and above the allowed 50 persons.
That's right. So what they were intending initially to look at for this facility was whether it might be used for those type of events where they may get, on those few occasions during the year, they may get groups of the other churches together for larger prayer meetings. But given the issues raised in the information request, and certainly taking into account submitters' concerns, the church made a conscious decision not to have those larger prayer meetings through the year. So they've now gone back to the 50 people twice a week, which is consistent with the other worship facilities in Toowoomba and outside Toowoomba.
No, thanks very much for that. Note your comments about material change of use versus code. And correct me if I'm wrong, you said the requirement for that strip doesn't extend to the southern end down towards the court, the road off the highway there. Is that right?
Yep.
So, and that's fine, but would it be a fair assumption to say that it would have probably been an unreasonable cost for the applicant to build a crossover across an overland flow path with flood mapping on it? Would have been quite prohibitive cost-wise, so hence come around through the court.
It was never the intention, Councillor, through the Chair, I'm sorry. It was never the intention to have a direct access to the highway, and that is consistent with the other approval at Top Kent Court. It has frontage to the highway, which meant it was code accessible. Its access comes off via the local road, which is Top Kent Court. It would be very unsafe trying to bring traffic directly off the highway so close to an intersection like that.
Yeah, no, I just note your comment, it could have been code accessible,
This is the frontage.
which has some advantages, but a disadvantage in an unsafe crossover, as you've said.
Yes.
And I guess we wouldn't, with a code accessible, we wouldn't have to consider other relevant matters that get brought into the discussion around an application either. So that's a bit of a moot point, I guess. The other thing that it's probably definitely a concern based on past experience in sitting around the table dealing with the aftermath of complaints, and I understand that sort of technology around alarms and accessibility from council officers to view and monitor, along with the applicant having a notification. Very familiar with other problems in other areas with trucking sewage out, because that's what you've effectively locked into with this site, is removal of sewage waste via truck. So
Yes, so that's why there's been 3 or 4 iterations of, through the Chair, of the on-site effluent disposal report. So as I was mentioning previously, there was a desire to perhaps use that overflow parking area as transpiration areas for the existing system, and it was brought back to being more of a contained treatment system as we've described, as per Council's request, as a means to allow for potential overflow parking areas. The concern the applicant had about a treatment system like that is actually the fact that even though there's the use twice a week, it is only for a few hours, so the toilet facilities may not actually get used enough to actually warrant having an expensive system like that installed. But they have certainly gone down the path of Council's recommendation in that regard, including the installation of a separate holding tank, the alarm and the QR code.
yeah, council officers' recommendations.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Paul.
Yes.
Paul, could I just ask you, I think you probably answer it, just in terms of the reservations around whether the numbers will stay at 50, even though that's the approval. Is it fair to say that this other one's being built because they kind of want to be model citizens, and the other one's got too small and they're sticking with their 50, so they're... That's right?
It is. They also the applicants informed me today, they've also got some of the Toowoomba families that go to some of the facilities here that are looking to maybe move into that area, and they just don't want to suddenly find they've got more people that they can cope with and are looking to build a new facility that will accommodate not only just immediate growth from the one that's been there for 10 years, but whether the new families move into the area as well.
So could you just address Mr. Reid's concern about the self-assessed noise? Could you just talk to that?
Certainly. Well, that's, it's not unusual where you've got an application such as a church or a school or something that may generate noise amenity issues where they locate in residential areas, for the council to ask for the applicant to prepare a noise impact assessment, which includes noise modelling. That noise modelling, as I was mentioning before, that's those loggers that are put out to actually capture that noise are not only trying to assist in determining what will the noise impacts of the facility be, but take into account what the current background noise levels are. So the noise assessment in this case looked at background noise levels for this site, taking into account highway traffic noise and so on, but then also looked at the operations of an existing facility, and you don't always have that advantage of having another similar facility to use. So that data then is crunched together to come up with a noise model of what is likely to be noise impacts emanating from the site. In this case, the noise report looked at the 8 closest sensitive receptors and then looked at the modelling of what that impact would be on those receptors, and then they make a determination on their professional opinion as to whether it's going to generate adverse impacts or not. But if I've said something wrong, please correct me.
And can I just ask one more point of clarification, and I'm not being frivolous here, about, so you refer to the meetings as prayer meetings, and
Yes.
so do we know, is there singing and
Sure.
music and...
Yes, that's a very valid question. So the way these worship facilities operate, they certainly will have doors and noise and windows closed. The only amplification they have is for the use of a microphone for those members of the congregation these days that are hard of hearing. The amplification is not used for musical instruments. If there is any singing, it's just voice only. It's not amplified in any way, and it's not accompanied by any instruments at all. And generally, there's still just a prayer meeting for worship purposes other than that.
Thank you. I've generated a few more questions now. Councillor Summerfield, Councillor McMahon, Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Just a few clarifications, if I might. So you mentioned earlier about funerals. Are there going to be funerals held there as well, which would be outside the realm of the 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Sunday and 5 to 8 p.m. Monday?
No, I'm not suggesting that it would be. Also, I guess I was referring to there is, whenever I've done a church application in the past, it's usually been a question of council officers. If there was a midweek funeral, where would people park? In this instance, that's not the intention here as far as I'm aware, but if it were, I guess you also have to look at then what is a frequency of use. So, for example, the planning scheme allows under its definitions for a temporary use where something may occur 12 times in a year, so long as it's not more than 5 consecutive days in a row. It may be something as under a temporary use arrangement, or it may be that infrequent that it actually isn't considered to be a change of use in its own right.
Okay, thank you. And then, did I hear you say that council wanted the overflow parking? Is that right?
Well, it certainly was being asked for when we were proposing to have that 110 people 7 or 8 times a year. It was definitely being looked at that point. It's been left there, I guess, because when the application was changed, and it was changed so that it is back to the 50 people twice a week, that change happened in response to information requested by the council that was submitted at the same time as the applicant responding to submitter issues. So some of the concerns raised by submitters were that there was going to be cars parked all along the street, and in the event of like when a prayer meeting was being held. So the car parking numbers that were designed for when it could have been those 7 or 8 times a year where it was larger was kept. The overflow parking was kept, more I guess to give assurance that it's not going to result in cars being parked on the street. But any of the parking surveys that were done and were submitted as part of that response by the applicant, also looking at what the planning scheme asked for, that was back to the 15 car parks for a facility of this scale.
Okay, thank you. So you were talking earlier about the footprint of the actual build by comparison to other surrounding homes that could potentially be very large homes and that sort of thing. And I get you making that comparison, but really it's about the traffic movement and the noise that comes with that, and the change in the quiet cul-de-sac is the reality of the impact rather than the actual footprint of the build. It's all the car movements that come with that, which changes a nice quiet cul-de-sac. And people buy in cul-de-sacs for that reason, so that they've got a nice quiet and they feel that their children are much more safe in those areas because there's no through traffic. So I think that was more. And then you talked about the second dwelling example, which we can now have, like the granny flat or whatever out the back, which is allowed now. And you were saying about the 21 extra movements. That would be per day on a Sunday and Monday, wouldn't it? That wouldn't be 21 extra movements a week.
That's right.
Yeah.
In terms of traffic assessment work, it's expressed in vehicle movements per day. That's the terminology or the rate that's used. The reason that I mentioned about the scale of the building and the impervious areas, there were comments made by councillors that just the scale of the car park, that amount of concrete was not consistent with the area, which was why I was making reference to that. The 21 vehicle movements per day, I was more making reference to what the development potential of this property would be if it was just purely used for residential purposes.
Yep.
That's why I was making that comparison.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Councillor McMahon.
Thank you, Chair. Paul, I just was something not raised by council or in the conditions, my just thinking with the old school teacher hat on, if there's kids playing after church or kicking a footy or whatever, and they're effectively in New England highway frontage, is that anything, I mean, I know there's a flood thing there that's not flooding very often, so coming from the back going over to the highway, is that anything that your reports or your consulting has planning for, or have you found it needs to be planned in there?
Through the Chair, Councillor, I think that level of parental control was probably left to the congregation members, and it's probably not something that can be conditioned at all. I guess in terms of the site though, that is quite a steep gully between the highway and where the flat area is, where the church is proposed to go. It is a bit of a deterrent even in itself, but yeah, I'm not sure that there's ways of conditioning for the parental control. Yeah.
Okay, Councillor McDonald.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Paul, just as a summary, you were mentioning about that it's your opinion or legal opinion that this could have been code accessible and its impact.
Yes.
Given that it has been impacting, gone through the process of submissions and a number of submissions and petitions, what have you changed or what's been changed from the original application to what we see today as a result of those submissions?
Through the Chair, so I guess the fundamental change has been the scale. So the scale has been consciously reduced back to 50 people twice a week. The notion of having the larger prayer meetings 7 or 8 times of the year has been removed altogether. That then has changed how we've looked at car parking, noise, access arrangements, on-site effluent disposal. But yes, and I suppose the other change that happened at that point was the design of the building. So council has asked from the original proposal put forward to have more windows, more openings, make the building look more residential in character, use more of a mix of building materials. So that change has also been done in response to council's information request. But I guess the fundamental change has been scale.
So just following up on that, so the hours of operation were always as is in the current situation. The flow of the traffic in and out and the amenity across the road from a resident, if there's no set aside area for car parking, has that at all been taken into account for traffic going in and out where the opposite driveways could be to that site in the design?
Well, one of the accesses has been kept in the location of the previous one where the house was previously, and it's been designed as an entry from the northern one on the left-hand side and exit via the southern one on the right-hand side to just generate a better traffic flow, as opposed to people being blocked that might be arriving for a prayer meeting all at once. There's just a better flow of traffic now using those two driveways, but certainly one of those is exactly where the original house one was before.
Thank you.
Councillor Bonhoff?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I just need clarity on the clarity that Councillor McDonald just sought. So, Paul, I had thought I heard you say that it's the Brethren's sort of preferred operating model to cap these churches at 50.
Yes.
But then I heard you just say that it was the decision to go back from 110 to 50 was in response to the oppositional submissions. So can I just have clarity on that, please?
Yes, so the 110, so the original application was 50 people twice a week, which is what it's now back to. The applicant also sought to have prayer meetings 7 or 8 times a year where a couple of congregations come together, and that was going to 110 people. So what they have consciously done is they're not going to proceed with that arrangement anymore. It's just going to be kept to the local congregation that will come to this worship facility, and that's been the change, is to take those, what would have been a couple of congregations coming together 7 or 8 times a year, out of the equation.
Okay, councillors, thank you very much for all of your questions. I think you're done. Thank you, Paul. Can I have someone move that we reinstate standing orders? Councillor Bonhoff, Councillor O'Shea, all those in favour? Okay. So the recommendation is that Council approve application MCUI 2022/3617 for a development permit for material change of use impact place of worship pursuant to the provisions of Section 60 of the Planning Act 2016 and subject to attachments 3 conditions. Can I have someone move that recommendation, please? Councillor McMahon and Councillor Taylor, you're going to second? No. Councillor McMahon has moved. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Shine? We'd like to go into debate. Yep. Councillor McMahon, as the mover, would you like to speak on this?
Thank you, Chair. We have a situation where it's a rather small church, I must say, and an ample car park. Before the details, there's the hedge at the front. I think I don't even know that you'd know it was there if you weren't looking. But I think we have a planning scheme that allows these, and every single issue has met the officer's recommendation here, or been conditioned to do so. And I think I'm just going to unlock this. Hang on. In the officer's recommendation on page 7 of board books, it is noted that along Schmidt Court and Bewley Drive, the traffic volumes generated by the development are significantly under the expected traffic volumes associated with the road hierarchy for each road. So we've conditioned the road, we've conditioned the noise, we've conditioned the flood, we've conditioned every other thing. And I think we have these parts of our planning scheme for a reason, and then we try and come in here and over-process it and try and pick holes in it. I think everything that the officers have asked for has been conditioned, and therefore it meets or is conditioned to meet all of the requirements within the planning scheme. So with that, I'm happy to move.
Okay. Councillor Bonhoff, speaker against.
Yes, thanks. And Wendy, could we get the aerial up, please? Yep, that's great, thank you. So councillors, we might have concerns about compliance and complaints and reassurances in regard to doors and windows being closed and the number of people in attendance and the times of operation. But we really have to, this isn't the first time we've been here, so we really have to stick to what are key defendable reasons for declining the officer's recommendation. So we have 145 signatures on petitions and 30 objections to this proposed development application in a rural residential zone. And I'll go to one of the first points that Councillor McMahon made, and it's around the traffic. So I'm going to talk about 3 key areas that are defensible for declining this. In regards to the traffic, we've got PO 15 and AO 15.1, where I believe that this application is not compliant, because the application for this development would introduce non-residential traffic into local roads, namely Schmidt Court and Bewley Drive. And the traffic assessment says that this DA, the volumes of traffic generated by this DA are within the tolerable range for the hierarchy of these roads. But that's not what the performance outcome or the acceptable outcome speaks to. They talk about whether or not a development application would be introducing traffic for non-residential use onto those local roads. And even our officers in this assessment have said that's correct and it would not comply. And furthermore, in further justification for seeing that PO 15 and AO 15.1 are not met, the officers assessed that the development nonetheless would not impact on the amenity of surrounding land uses. And now that's been refuted by Mr. Jeff this afternoon, who talked about, as a person who lives in close proximity to this development, the rural residential nature of the neighbourhood and the children and the families playing in that area. And that, to me, speaks loudly to the amenity of the surrounding areas. I think the biggest areas, that's point 1, the traffic and the local roads. Point 2, this assessment hinges on whether or not it meets the requirements of AO 1.1 and PO 1, which is, does it meet the requirements of the day-to-day needs of local residents? And there's been this is subjective, and therefore I think it is defensible for us to oppose the recommendation. We have 175 locals who have said that they are in opposition to this development, and therefore surely they are best placed to make a determination about whether this application meets the needs day to day of local residents, and they have resoundingly said no, it doesn't. There is an existing church 700 metres away, or a 1-minute drive. So again, that's further justification that it does not meet or comply with PO1 or AO 1.1. Third and lastly, this proposal is for a single-storey building covering 148 square metres. And it has been assessed as being consistent with the low density form of housing of rural residential. Now, I can accept 148 square metres is consistent with the rural residential, but what is not consistent with rural residential and the neighbouring dwellings is 21 car parks with room for 28 more on the grass, a total of 49 car spaces, which checks out when you think that this is a dwelling, this is intended for 50 people. So for 49 car parks, and when you look at that aerial, I do not agree with the assessment that 49 car parks, or at a minimum 21 formed car parks, is consistent with the scale and nature of what we see up there. We see some turning bays, but nothing is to the scale or the nature of PO2 Section C or PO2 Section D. Again, what we are considering here, we have to make sure is defensible should this end up in court. And I've given 3 reasons. Firstly, the traffic and road uses and the relevant PO and AO. Secondly, it's inconsistent in terms of scale and nature with the planning scheme of rural residential and existing neighbourhood. And thirdly, it doesn't meet the day-to-day needs of local residents, and they've clearly told us that. They can't be any clearer in that, and we need to hear them and we need to represent them. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll end my debate, but also flag, if this motion is unsuccessful, my intention to move an alternate recommendation to refuse this development application.
Thanks, Councillor Von Hoff. Councillor Shine is the seconder of the motion. Did you want to speak for it?
No, thanks, Chair. I just like to support the arguments put forward by Councillor McMahon. Clearly, the interaction between the officers and the applicants here through their town planning experts has been long-standing and ongoing and exhausting. The officers have made recommendations without qualification, with an eye, no doubt, on what might happen in an appeal if it were to be rejected. I have every confidence in the expertise and decision of our officers in relation to this matter.
Okay. Another speaker against? Councillor Carl.
Thanks, Chair. I'm going to speak against this motion as put by the officers for approval. One of the matters I'd like to raise, and I raised it with Mr. Kelly, and it was a moot point of whether it could have been code accessible or material change of use. I think the code accessible argument is superfluous, because the reality is, as stated, it was unsafe and I suspect unaffordable by the applicant to actually comply with code assessment and access off the highway, as the point something of a metre strip didn't extend to the southern end of the allotment. So, you know, that's why they've obviously, in my humble opinion, chosen the material change of use avenue to gain access through residential streets, which is more than adequately been explained by Councillor Rebecca, that it doesn't meet a performance outcome, which is considerable concern over and above an acceptable outcome. The other thing, whilst I respect the professionalism and the technical expertise of our officers, with the greatest of respect, this applicant has been, in my personal opinion, allowed special dispensation with regard of waste removal, sewerage, to be dealt with by trucking out for as long as this facility exists, and potentially to a new owner that may own this facility, rather than treat it, regardless of the use, the amount of use twice a week, for it to be treated accordingly with normal regulations and other applicant requirements, or that would be normally imposed. So I think the applicant's probably been given a special dispensation on the basis of cost, when that's a normal building reg and health regulation. So I won't re-prosecute the other arguments that have been put, except to say I think there are enough glaring topics here for us to be able to not recommend this for approval. Thank you.
Is there another speaker for the motion? No. Okay, with that, sum up, Councillor McMahon.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I find that when these come to us, it is our job to look at objectively a building at 148 square metres, regardless of who's in it, and look at it where it's put. And I think when we look at it of what it is, it's a building. It's not our job to, and I asked this early on, is it our job to consider that there's another place of worship for the same church 700 metres away? And I think I read another one 4 k's away in Middle Ridge. It's not. It's our job to look at this particular development here. And when we talk about the community need, if it's addressing the need of the individuals around Top Camp, it's addressing a community need. I think that we have officers who are experts in this, who have come to us and said car parking, and then they've said it has been developed to meet with the council's planning scheme, and we have all these arguments the car park's too big. I'd frankly be more concerned if it was too little and they were doing on-street car parking. It's the perfect car park hidden away from street view for this kind of building. We talk about road congestion, and then we have the officers say that this the engineer report developed in 2022 said that these roads are well underutilized, or they're not to exceeded traffic volumes that they can be for those local roads. We talk about hours and noise, going back to the idea that this building is going to be used 6 hours a week, 3 on Sunday morning and 3 on Monday night. We talk about noise, and fair enough, I had that concern too, and we look at the conditions that are put in place and the idea that I honestly don't think you'd hear them if you weren't inside the building. And so my job is to look at it objectively. We've got a building that's asking to be approved, and we've got officers that are happy with everything we've raised as a concern, saying this meets planning scheme requirements or can be conditioned to. And then we come along and say we actually know better than the officers and say that, no, I don't think you're right, it can't. So,
Point of order, Madam Chair. I don't like the implication that we know better than officers. That is unnecessary. Please, please withdraw it.
sorry,
Withdrawing? Are you
I withdraw, I apologise.
Might sum up. Thanks, Councillor.
I didn't mean to say, I shouldn't have said we know better than the officers, but we certainly don't take their expertise, and I believe we should. And so my job is to look at objectively at this as a development application, and I think it meets every single one of the requirements it's put to. I don't have any defensible reasons why I shouldn't, and that's why I propose it needs to be moved. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll put the recommendation that council approve the application. All those in favour? The motion is lost. Councillor Von Hoff, did you want to put your alternate recommendation?
I do, thank you, Madam Chair. Wendy, would you mind getting the original recommendation up, please? Thank you. And I'll just seek advice, potentially through you, Madam Chair, to the CEO or Dr. Stepanov, if the appropriate wording is that council refuse or that council recommend refusal of application. Recommends refusal or just refuse? Okay, thank you. Then the motion that I propose is that council refuse application number MCU I /2022 / thank you, Wendy, 3617 for a development permit for material change of use impact, place of worship pursuant to provisions of Section 60 of the Planning Act 2016. I'm happy to give reasons. Okay, so Wendy, bear with me. In the first instance, that the application before us does not meet or comply with performance outcome 1 or acceptable outcome 1.1. So performance outcome 1 or acceptable outcome 1.1. Thank you, Chris. and specifically I refer to that it does not meet the requirements of day-to-day needs of local residents, as evidenced by, but not limited to, the number of submissions objecting to this development application. Okay. Can they do that? C and D, yeah. I'll ask. And I'm happy to take advice from officers as well, Madam Chair.
You wanting advice, councillor, on?
If there's specific wordings that I need to include in that.
Councillor, through the chair, could I clarify performance outcome 1 and acceptable outcome AO 1.1? Which code or table does that sit in?
I have board books page 29 and 30. So this is table 6.6.7:2.
And thank you, councillor. Just to clarify, is your reason for that the reasons you stated being?
That it
I've just
doesn't.
had, sorry, councillor, I've just, CEO's suggested maybe we adjourn the meeting while you
Sure.
give you a chance to
That's
do
fine.
that. So we might adjourn for 5 minutes or so. Yeah, thank you. Move that. Yeah, councillor Von Hoff, councillor McDonald, all those in favour? It's carried. Thank you.
Good advice, thank you.
Okay, councillors, we'll resume the meeting. Now, Councillor Von Hoff, you foreshadowed an alternative motion.
I did, and I've, with officers' help and Wendy's good patience, listed the reasons for the decision. And those are that the application does not advance the purpose of the Planning Act 2016 as it is not consistent with the expectations of the local community as expressed to council through properly made submissions. The application does not comply with the following assessment benchmarks. In the Rural Residential Zone Code, the purpose of the code. It is not consistent with the purpose of the zone because it does not provide for residential development on large lots where local government infrastructure and services may not be provided and where the intensity of residential development is generally dispersed. It is not for a range of residential housing styles to meet the needs of the community, and the development does not maintain a semi-rural landscape character. Furthermore, the overall outcomes of the code. The overall outcomes sought for the zone code are as follows. It does not preserve the environmental and topographical features of the land by integrating an appropriate scale of residential activities amongst these features. It is not designed to incorporate sustainable practices including maximising energy efficiency and encouraging sustainable transport use. It does not provide a high level of residential amenity. It is not a non-residential use that meets the day-to-day convenience needs of the residential catchment in the zone or has, it does not, and or has a direct, or have, sorry, it's right, Wendy, or have a direct relationship and rely on the endemic characteristics of the land in which it is located. It is not compatible with the semi-rural and low-intensity residential character of the zone and is not consistent with the following outcomes. Point 1, non-residential uses are not located in areas with limited infrastructure and services necessary to meet the needs of the development. Point 2, shop, community use, healthcare services and veterinary services with a building form of a scale consistent with the surrounding rural residential locality. Point 3, adverse impacts of land use both on-site and from adjoining areas are avoided and any unavoidable impacts are minimised through location, design, operation and management. It does not have access to all development infrastructure including utility installations and essential services. In table 6.6.7:1, performance outcome 15. The non-residential use is not located on a major road and does introduce non-residential traffic into local streets. Acceptable outcome 15.1. The non-residential use does not have effective frontage to a vehicle access from a regional, arterial, sub-arterial or distributor road, and vehicle access to the development does occur from a local street. Table 6.6.7:2, performance outcome 1, the application does not accommodate very low density forms of housing and other small scale uses that service the day-to-day needs of local residents. Acceptable outcome 1.1, it is not consistent with the intent of the zone because it is not any of those following dot points. A place of worship is not listed there. And performance outcome 2, the non-residential use does not provide for the day-to-day needs of the immediate rural residential community, is not of a nature that is compatible with the semi-rural and low-intensity residential character of the zone, and lastly, is not a scale that is consistent with the surrounding rural residential area and does not duly detract from the amenity of nearby residences. I so move.
Okay, Councillor Von Hoff has moved, Councillor Carla seconded. All those in favour? That's carried. Division, yeah. Those in favour? Those against? Okay, meeting concluded. Thank you, everyone.
We'll have just 10 minutes, councillors, if we can, and will officers come to the room and they'll commence or recommence our meeting from yesterday.